In the quiet suburbs of a mid-sized Midwestern city, where autumn leaves painted the streets in shades of gold and crimson, Officer Reynolds and his partner were conducting their routine patrol. The late September evening was drawing to a close, casting long shadows across the well-maintained lawns of Oak Ridge neighborhood. Their shift had been uneventful until they spotted a midnight blue Jeep Wrangler with slightly tinted windows rolling through a stop sign. The vehicle caught their attention not just for the minor traffic violation, but because it seemed out of place in this predominantly upper-middle-class neighborhood. The Jeep, though well-maintained, had mud splattered across its sides and bore out-of-state plates. Following standard procedure, they flipped on their lights and initiated a traffic stop. The Jeep pulled over smoothly, but what happened next would shake the foundation of the entire police department. The driver, a well-dressed black man in his early 40s, remained perfectly still with both hands visible on the steering wheel. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the tension that quickly filled the air. Officer Reynolds approached the vehicle with his hand resting on his holster, a habit formed from years of traffic stops gone wrong. His partner, Officer Chen, stood ready at the rear of the Jeep, flashlight beam cutting through the growing darkness. "License and registration," Reynolds barked, his voice carrying more edge than necessary. The driver spoke with a measured tone, "They're in my glove compartment, officer. I'm going to reach for them now." His voice carried the weight of someone who had been through this scenario countless times before. As he reached slowly for his documents, Reynolds noticed the man's expensive watch and tailored suit, details that seemed to clash with his initial assumptions. What started as a routine traffic stop quickly escalated when Officer Reynolds claimed he smelled something suspicious. Despite the driver's protests and clear explanation that he had just moved to the area, the officers ordered him out of the vehicle. What followed was a thorough, some might say excessive, search of the immaculate Jeep. The officers pulled out carefully packed boxes from the trunk, tossing aside professional documents and personal belongings. Family photos scattered across the pavement, and a framed law enforcement certification crashed to the ground, its glass cracking on impact. The driver stood by, maintaining his composure even as his possessions littered the street, his years of law enforcement training evident in his controlled breathing and steady gaze. Local residents began to emerge from their homes, cell phones raised to record the scene unfolding on their quiet street. The blue and red lights painted their concerned faces as they witnessed what appeared to be yet another incident of profiling in their community. Some began to whisper among themselves, questioning the officers' aggressive approach. What the officers didn't know, what they couldn't have known as they systematically dismantled the contents of the Jeep, was that this traffic stop would become a turning point in their careers. The man they were treating with such suspicion had a badge of his own, one that would soon carry more weight than theirs in this very department. As the search stretched past the 20-minute mark and no contraband was found, the driver finally spoke up again. His voice remained steady, but now carried an authority that made both officers pause. "I think you've done enough damage for one evening, officers. Now, would you like to explain to your new chief of police why you felt it necessary to destroy his personal property on his first day in town?" The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Reynolds' flashlight beam wavered, and Officer Chen's notepad slipped from his suddenly nervous fingers. The gravity of their mistake began to sink in as they realized they had just welcomed their new boss to town in the worst possible way. The following morning, the police station buzzed with nervous energy. Word of the previous night's incident had spread like wildfire through the department. Officers gathered in small groups, whispering about the unfortunate welcome their new chief had received. The break room coffee went cold as everyone waited for the other shoe to drop. At precisely 8 a.m., Chief Richardson walked through the front doors of the station. Despite the previous night's ordeal, he carried himself with dignity in a crisp navy suit. The lobby fell silent as he passed through, officers straightening their postures instinctively. His shoes clicked against the linoleum floors, each step echoing in the unusually quiet building. Instead of heading straight to his office, the chief made an unexpected stop at the dispatch desk. "Good morning," he said warmly to the surprised dispatcher. "I'd like to call an all-hands meeting in the main conference room in 30 minutes. His voice was firm but carried no trace of the anger many had expected. The dispatcher quickly sent out the notification, her hands slightly trembling as she typed. Officers Reynolds and Chen arrived early to the conference room, their uniforms perfectly pressed as if trying to make up for the previous night's transgression. They sat rigid in their chairs, watching as their colleagues filtered in. Some officers avoided eye contact with them, while others offered sympathetic glances. The room was packed when Chief Richardson entered. He carried no files, no paperwork, just a single coffee cup that he placed carefully on the podium. The silence was thick enough to cut with a knife as he surveyed the room, his gaze lingering momentarily on Reynolds and Chen. "Good morning," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "I imagine most of you have heard about last night's incident. Let me be clear, this meeting isn't about punishment or public shaming. This is about growth and understanding." He paused, letting his words sink in. The chief shared his own story, 25 years in law enforcement, working his way up from patrol officer to detective, then to leadership positions in departments across the country. He spoke about the challenges he'd faced, not just as a black officer, but as someone committed to changing the system from within. "What happened last night," he continued, "isn't unique to this department or this city. But what happens next, that's where we have the opportunity to be different." He pulled out his phone and played a video that had already gone viral, captured by one of the residents showing the search of his Jeep. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they watched their colleagues tear through the chief's belongings. The video ended with a clear shot of a family photo lying face down in a puddle, the chief's 3 children smiling up at the camera, their faces reflected in the dirty water. "This video has over 100,000 views already," the chief said quietly. "But I'm not interested in what social media has to say. I'm interested in what we're going to do about it. Not just about this incident, but about the underlying issues it represents." He outlined his vision for the department: enhanced training programs, community engagement initiatives, and a complete overhaul of traffic stop procedures. But what caught everyone off guard was his next announcement. "Officers Reynolds and Chen will be leading our new community outreach program," he declared. The 2 officers' heads snapped up in surprise. "They'll be working directly with local community leaders to build bridges between law enforcement and the neighborhoods we serve. Sometimes, the best teachers are those who have learned the hardest lessons." The tension in the room began to shift. What had started as a meeting dreaded by many was transforming into something unexpected, a masterclass in leadership and grace under pressure. The chief wasn't just talking about change, he was demonstrating it in real time. As the meeting drew to a close, Chief Richardson addressed Officers Reynolds and Chen directly. "I'd like to see you both in my office after this. We have some work to do." His tone wasn't threatening, but rather carried the weight of opportunity, a chance to turn a mistake into a milestone. The other officers filed out, their conversations now focused not on the scandal they'd expected, but on the surprising turn of events. Through the station's windows, they could see news vans beginning to gather in the parking lot. The story was about to break wide open, but somehow, their new chief had already changed the narrative. In the empty conference room, Chief Richardson gathered his coffee cup, pausing to look at a photo of the department that hung on the wall. It showed the force from 5 years ago, less diverse, more rigid in their poses. He smiled slightly, knowing that the photo they'd take next year would tell a very different story. Sometimes, he thought, the most powerful changes come from the most uncomfortable moments. The story exploded across local media within hours. News helicopters circled over the police station like buzzards, while reporters camped outside with their microphones ready. Social media was ablaze with opinions, the viral video of the Jeep search playing on countless screens across the country. But inside the chief's office, a different story was unfolding. Officers Reynolds and Chen sat across from Chief Richardson, their badges catching the morning light that filtered through the blinds. The chief's damaged family photo lay on the desk between them, a silent reminder of the previous night's events. The glass was still cracked, splintering across the smiling faces of his children. "Tell me," the chief began, leaning back in his chair, "what made you decide to escalate that stop?" His tone wasn't accusatory, instead, it carried genuine curiosity. The officers exchanged glances, the weight of their actions sitting heavy on their shoulders. Officer Reynolds spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was the neighborhood, sir. The out-of-state plates. The tinted windows." He paused, the words catching in his throat. "We've had drug trafficking issues in that area, and I thought." His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow his justification sounded. The chief nodded slowly, pulling out a thick folder from his desk drawer. "This is my plan for the department," he said, opening it to reveal detailed community engagement strategies. "But first, I want you to see something." He turned his computer monitor around, showing security footage from his previous department. The video showed a younger version of himself, conducting a traffic stop. His approach was different, respectful, professional, but thorough. "I've been on both sides of this equation," he explained. "I've made stops that saved lives, and I've been stopped myself more times than I can count. The difference isn't in what we do, it's in how we do it." Meanwhile, outside the station, community leaders had begun to gather. The local NAACP chapter president stood shoulder to shoulder with church leaders, small business owners, and concerned citizens. They weren't there to protest, though, they were there to respond to an unprecedented invitation from the new chief. By afternoon, the station's largest conference room had been transformed. The usual rows of chairs were arranged in a circle, with the chief sitting not at the head of the room, but among the community members. Officers Reynolds and Chen were there too, their presence a testament to the chief's commitment to transparency. "What happened last night," the chief addressed the gathered crowd, "was a symptom of a larger issue. But it's also an opportunity." He gestured to the officers. "These officers made a mistake, yes. But they're also going to be part of the solution." The community leaders listened as the chief outlined his vision. Body cameras would now be mandatory for all officers, with footage regularly reviewed by a civilian oversight committee. Traffic stop protocols would be overhauled, with clear guidelines for escalation. But most surprisingly, he announced the creation of a community police partnership program, with officers Reynolds and Chen as its first participants. An elderly community leader stood up, her voice carrying years of wisdom and skepticism. "We've heard promises before, Chief. What makes this different?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Chief Richardson. He walked to the center of the circle, pulling out his damaged family photo. "Because this isn't just policy for me," he said, passing the photo around. "This is personal. Every person we stop is someone's child, someone's parent, someone's loved one. When we forget that, we forget our purpose." The photo made its way around the room, each person handling it carefully, seeing not just the broken glass but the humanity it represented. When it reached Officer Chen, his hands trembled slightly. "I have kids too," he said softly, looking at the chief's children's smiling faces. "I never thought about how they might feel, seeing their father treated like that." As the meeting continued, something remarkable began to happen. The tension in the room gradually transformed into productive dialogue. Community members shared their experiences with law enforcement, both positive and negative. Officers spoke about their fears and challenges on the job. Real conversations were happening, perhaps for the first time. Outside, the media circus continued, but they were missing the real story. They wanted scandal and conflict, but inside that room, something more powerful was taking shape: understanding. The chief's decision to turn a potential crisis into a catalyst for change was rewriting the narrative. The meeting ran well into the evening, and as people began to leave, handshakes turned into exchanges of contact information. Plans were made for future meetings, committees were formed, and tentative bridges began to span old divides. As the last community member left, Chief Richardson turned to Officers Reynolds and Chen. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start the real work. I hope you're ready." Both officers nodded, standing a little straighter than they had that morning. They were no longer just officers who had made a mistake, they were part of a bigger story, one of transformation and hope. The chief watched them leave, then turned to the window. The news vans were finally pulling away, probably disappointed by the lack of controversy they'd hoped to find. But he smiled, knowing that sometimes the most powerful changes happen not in the spotlight, but in quiet rooms where people choose to listen to each other. 2 weeks after the infamous traffic stop, the Oak Ridge Community Center buzzed with activity. The usually quiet building had been transformed into a hub of change, with Officers Reynolds and Chen setting up chairs for their first community outreach session. Their hands were steady now, but their hearts raced with anticipation. The chief had given them a challenging first assignment: spend a full day with the families they served, not as officers, but as listeners. No uniforms, no badges, just plain clothes and open minds. The community center's walls were lined with photos of local families, including one of the chief's damaged family portrait, now carefully restored and hanging as a reminder of why they were there. As people began filtering in, the officers noticed something unexpected. Instead of hostile stares, they were met with curious glances. The viral video had made them infamous, but the chief's response had made them symbols of something else: the possibility of change. A young mother approached Officer Chen, her small daughter clutching her hand. "My daughter saw the video," she said softly. "She's been afraid of police officers ever since. I brought her here today because she needs to see that people can learn and grow." Chen knelt down to the child's level, his heart heavy with the realization of how their actions had affected even the youngest members of their community. Across the room, Officer Reynolds was deep in conversation with a local business owner who had witnessed the traffic stop. "I've been running my shop here for 30 years, the man said, his gray hair catching the fluorescent light. "I've seen plenty of changes in this neighborhood, but nothing quite like what's happening now." The chief arrived quietly, choosing to observe from the back of the room. He watched as his officers navigated difficult conversations with grace they didn't know they possessed. Every uncomfortable question, every shared story of negative encounters with law enforcement, became an opportunity for genuine dialogue. During the lunch break, a local food truck owner, who had also seen the viral video, insisted on providing meals for everyone. As people ate together, the artificial barriers began to crumble. Officers and community members found themselves sharing not just food, but stories about their families, their hopes, and their fears. The afternoon session took an unexpected turn when a teenager stood up to speak. His voice shook slightly, but his words carried strength. "Last month, I got pulled over for a broken taillight. I was terrified because I'd seen too many videos of traffic stops gone wrong. But the officer who stopped me was different, he was respectful, explained everything he was doing. That officer is in this room today." All eyes turned to Officer Reynolds, who recognized the young man immediately. It had been a routine stop, one of hundreds he'd conducted. But this one had happened after the chief's intervention, after he'd begun to change his approach. The teenager's words hung in the air, proof that small changes could make a significant difference. The chief stepped forward then, joining the conversation. "Change isn't just about new policies," he said, his voice carrying across the now quiet room. "It's about new perspectives." Officer Reynolds handled that stop differently because he'd experienced what it feels like to be on the other side of his own actions. As the day progressed, the community center became more than just a meeting place, it became a space for transformation. Officers Reynolds and Chen shared their own journey of the past 2 weeks, how they'd begun to see their role in the community differently. They talked about the late-night conversations they'd had with their families, the soul-searching, and the commitment to do better. The chief's innovative approach was already showing results beyond this room. Reports came in from other officers about more positive interactions during traffic stops. Complaints had decreased, while community cooperation had increased. The department's social media pages, once filled with angry comments, now showcased stories of positive police-community interactions. As the session drew to a close, Officer Chen noticed the young girl who had been afraid of police officers earlier. She was now helping to clean up, carefully stacking chairs alongside her mother. When she saw him looking, she didn't hide behind her mother this time. Instead, she offered a small wave. The chief gathered everyone for a final word. The setting sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the community center floor. Today wasn't about forgetting the past, he said, looking around the room. It was about learning from it. Every person in this room has shown courage, the courage to face uncomfortable truths, to listen, and to grow. Outside, the evening news crews had gathered again, hoping to capture something controversial. Instead, they filmed people leaving the community center together, engaged in genuine conversation. Officers Reynolds and Chen walked out last, carrying boxes of leftover refreshments to share with the night shift at the station. The chief watched from the doorway as his officers loaded their cars. They moved differently now, carried themselves with a new awareness. They weren't just wearing their badges anymore, they were beginning to understand what those badges truly meant. As darkness fell over Oak Ridge, the community center's lights dimmed, but the impact of the day continued to ripple outward. In homes across the neighborhood, families discussed what they'd witnessed. On police radios, officers shared stories of the day's events. And in the chief's office, a new frame appeared on the wall, a photo from today's session, showing officers and community members working together, proving that sometimes the best way to fix a broken system is to first bring together the people within it. 1 month after the community center meeting, the police department's break room was filled with an unusual sight. Officers gathered around a large wall calendar, signing up for community engagement shifts with enthusiasm that would have been unthinkable just weeks ago. The once dreaded assignments had become highly sought after, with officers trading shifts to participate. The chief stood in the doorway, coffee cup in hand, observing the scene with quiet satisfaction. Officer Reynolds was explaining to a rookie about his recent experience coaching at the youth basketball program they'd started. "It's different when they see you as coach instead of just a badge," he said, his eyes bright with genuine excitement. "These kids, they tell you things they'd never say to a uniform." Across town, Officer Chen was leading a different kind of initiative. The department had converted an old mobile command center into a traveling community service station. Today, it was parked outside a local grocery store, offering everything from car seat safety checks to ID services. The line of residents waiting to enter stretched around the block. Inside the mobile unit, Chen worked alongside community volunteers, his sleeves rolled up as he helped an elderly resident fill out paperwork for a new state ID. The woman squinted at the forms, then looked up at him with recognition. "You're one of the officers from that video," she said quietly. Chen nodded, expecting the usual tension to follow. Instead, she smiled. "My grandson told me what you've been doing in the community. Says you're showing them what real change looks like." Back at the station, the chief was reviewing the latest department statistics with his command staff. Complaint rates had dropped by 40% in just 1 month. Community tips leading to solved cases had increased by 60%. But the most striking change was in the officers themselves. The daily briefings had transformed from tense, procedural meetings into collaborative planning sessions. A young officer raised her hand during one such briefing. "Chief, I had an idea," she began, slightly nervous but determined. "What if we started a program where community members could shadow us during our shift preparations? Let them see how we train, how we prepare, all the safety protocols we follow. The room fell silent, waiting for the chief's response. He smiled, remembering his own early days of trying to bridge the gap between police and community. "Write up a proposal," he said. "But first, talk to Officers Reynolds and Chen. They've learned a few things about what works and what doesn't." The story of the department's transformation had begun to attract attention beyond city limits. News outlets from across the country sent reporters to cover what they called the Oak Ridge model. But unlike the initial viral video, these stories focused on the positive changes taking place. The chief, however, remained cautious about the publicity. "This isn't about making headlines," he told his officers during an afternoon briefing. "This is about making lasting change." He pointed to a new addition on the briefing room wall, a collection of thank you letters from community members. "These matter more than any news story." One letter stood out, written in careful crayon strokes: "Dear police, thank you for playing basketball with us. Now I want to be a police officer too." But a nice one like Coach Reynolds. The note was accompanied by a child's drawing of a police officer smiling and holding a basketball. The department's parking lot had become a gathering place for impromptu community meetings. Food trucks, once wary of setting up near the police station, now had regular spots. Officers and residents could be seen sharing meals, the barriers between them dissolving one conversation at a time. Officer Reynolds, now leading the department's youth outreach program, had organized a series of "Chat with a Cop" sessions at local schools. But these weren't the standard drug awareness lectures of the past. Instead, they were open dialogues where students could ask anything, even difficult questions about police misconduct and accountability. During one such session, a high school student asked Reynolds about the night he'd searched the chief's Jeep. Instead of becoming defensive, Reynolds used it as a teaching moment. "I made a mistake," he said honestly. "But mistakes don't define you, how you respond to them does." The chief's damaged family photo had become something of a symbol within the department. Officers would pass by it daily, the restored frame a reminder of both past mistakes and the possibility of repair. But now it was accompanied by new photos, officers at community events, playing with local kids, helping elderly residents, each image telling a story of transformation. One evening, as the sun set over Oak Ridge, the chief found Officers Reynolds and Chen in the break room, long after their shifts had ended. They were planning the next community event, their enthusiasm evident in the pages of notes spread across the table. "You know," Chen said, looking up as the chief entered, "when you first assigned us to community outreach, I thought it was punishment. Now I can't imagine doing anything else." Reynolds nodded in agreement, adding, "We're not just policing anymore, we're actually part of this community." The chief pulled up a chair, joining their planning session. Through the window, he could see the city skyline, lights twinkling in the gathering dusk. In just a month, so much had changed, yet he knew this was just the beginning. Real transformation takes time, consistency, and commitment. A dispatch call came through, a minor traffic incident a few blocks away. The chief watched as a young officer responded, her voice calm and professional. Through the station windows, he could see her approach the scene, not with suspicion or authority, but with the new standard of respect and understanding that was becoming the hallmark of the Oak Ridge Police Department. 2 months into the Oak Ridge transformation, neighboring police departments began to take notice. What started as casual inquiries turned into formal requests for guidance. The chief's inbox filled with emails from other departments asking about the Oak Ridge model, while Officers Reynolds and Chen found themselves invited to speak at regional law enforcement conferences. One crisp morning, the chief arrived at work to find the parking lot filled with unfamiliar police vehicles. Police chiefs and representatives from 6 neighboring counties had shown up, hoping to observe Oak Ridge's morning briefing. Rather than turn them away, the chief saw an opportunity. "Welcome to Oak Ridge," he addressed the visitors, standing in the briefing room that now doubled as a community meeting space. "But instead of just watching, I'd like you to participate." He gestured to Officer Reynolds, who began distributing safety vests. "We're about to start our morning community walk. You're all welcome to join." The visiting officers exchanged uncertain glances as Oak Ridge officers paired up with community members who had arrived for the daily walk. This simple initiative, started by Officer Chen, had officers walking their beats alongside residents, learning about their neighborhoods from the people who lived there. A police chief from a neighboring city fell into step beside Chief Richardson as they walked through Oak Ridge's streets. "I'll be honest," the visiting chief said, watching as ahead of them, an Oak Ridge officer stopped to help a resident unload groceries from her car. "When I saw that viral video 2 months ago, I thought your career was over. Instead, you've turned it into this." He gestured at the scene around them, officers and citizens walking together, greeting each other by name, sharing stories and concerns. Back at the station, Officer Chen was leading a training session for officers from various departments. The topic wasn't typical police procedure. Instead, he was teaching them about community engagement strategies. "The hardest part," he explained, "is admitting we need to change. The second hardest part is actually changing. But the rewards." He paused, showing a photo of himself playing chess with a group of seniors at the community center. "The rewards make it all worth it." The transformation hadn't gone unnoticed by state officials either. The governor's office had sent representatives to study the Oak Ridge approach, considering it as a model for statewide police reform. They sat in on traffic stop reviews, where officers and community members together watched body camera footage, discussing what went right and what could be improved. During one such review session, a state official watched in amazement as Officer Reynolds critiqued his own recent traffic stop. "See here," Reynolds pointed to the screen, "I could have explained the reason for the stop more clearly. And my body language, I'm still too tense." The official scribbled notes furiously, struck by the level of self-awareness and willingness to improve. The chief's damaged family photo had become something of a legend among law enforcement circles. Departments across the state had begun displaying their own symbolic reminders of the importance of human connection in police work. One department chose to display a wall of community photos, while another created a bridge builders wall featuring officers and citizens working together. As word spread, journalists from national publications began arriving in Oak Ridge. They expected to find a carefully managed PR campaign but instead discovered genuine change. They watched as officers Reynolds and Chen, once the subjects of viral infamy, now led by example, showing other departments how to rebuild trust with their communities. During a lunch break at a regional police training session, an officer from a rural department approached Chen. "We don't have the same resources you do in Oak Ridge," he said. "How can we implement these changes with limited funding?" Chen smiled, pulling out his phone to show pictures of their early community meetings. "It didn't start with resources," he explained. "It started with conversations. The rest followed." The Oak Ridge station had become a hub of innovation in community policing. The walls were now covered with maps showing the expansion of their programs, youth mentorship initiatives, senior safety workshops, business owner partnerships. Each pin on the map represented a connection made, a bridge built. One afternoon, the chief received an unexpected visitor, the elderly woman whose security camera had captured the original viral video of his traffic stop. She came bearing a USB drive. "I've been recording again," she said, "but this time, I'm capturing different moments." The drive contained clips of officers helping neighbors, playing with children, and engaging with the community. "This is the story that needs to go viral now," she said. The department's break room had evolved into an informal gathering space where officers from different jurisdictions would drop by to observe and learn. The coffee machine ran constantly as stories and strategies were shared. Officers who had once been skeptical of change now found themselves teaching others how to implement it. During one such gathering, a rookie officer from a neighboring department asked Reynolds about handling resistance to change within the ranks. Reynolds thought for a moment, then pulled out his phone. "See this?" He showed a text message from a teenager he'd mentored. "When officers resist change, I show them messages like this. Remind them why we chose this profession in the first place, to help people, to make a difference." As the day drew to a close, the chief stood in his office, looking out over the city. The parking lot was still full of vehicles from visiting departments, their presence a testament to the ripple effect of positive change. On his desk lay invitations to speak at police academies, requests for training programs, and letters from other cities hoping to implement their own versions of the Oak Ridge model. Officer Chen knocked on his door, report in hand. "Chief, you need to see these numbers," he said excitedly. 3 other departments have adopted our community engagement program, and their initial results. He trailed off as he noticed the chief's expression. "What is it, sir?" The chief smiled, picking up his restored family photo. "I was just thinking," he said, "about how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. 2 months ago, we were a department in crisis. Now we're helping others transform their own departments." He placed the photo back on his desk. "But our work here isn't done. It's just beginning." 3 months into Oak Ridge's transformation, the true test of their changes began to emerge. The initial excitement had settled into routine, and with it came new challenges. The chief sat in his office, reviewing reports from the past week, when Officer Reynolds knocked on his door, his expression troubled. "We've got a situation, Chief," Reynolds said, closing the door behind him. "Some of the newer officers are struggling with the extended community engagement hours. They're saying it's cutting into their regular patrol duties." The chief nodded, having anticipated this growing pain. The success of their programs had led to increased demands on officer time, creating a delicate balancing act. Meanwhile, Officer Chen was facing his own challenges at the community center. The initial group of engaged citizens had grown so large that they'd outgrown their meeting space. More importantly, some community members were becoming impatient with the pace of change, expecting immediate solutions to long-standing problems. During a particularly tense community meeting, an elderly resident stood up, her voice shaking with emotion. "All these new programs are wonderful," she said, "but we still have drug deals happening on my street. What good is playing basketball with kids if we can't solve the real problems?" The room fell silent, the question hanging heavy in the air. Chen stepped forward, remembering his own journey from skeptic to believer. "You're right," he acknowledged, surprising many in the room. "These programs aren't magic solutions. They're tools that help us work together to address those deeper problems." He pulled out a map, showing how community tips had actually increased drug-related arrests by 30% since the programs began. Back at the station, the chief was implementing a new strategy to address the growing pains. He'd created a rotation system that balanced community engagement with traditional police work, ensuring officers remained sharp in both areas. But more importantly, he was working to show how the two approaches complemented each other. During a department-wide meeting, he shared a recent success story. A teenage boy who'd attended Officer Reynolds' basketball program had provided information that led to the arrest of a major drug supplier. The tip came not because of traditional police work, but because the team trusted Reynolds enough to come forward. "This isn't about choosing between community policing and traditional law enforcement," the chief explained to his officers. "It's about making both stronger through connection." He unveiled a new initiative called Integrated Policing, a system that would formally combine community engagement with tactical operations. The program faced its first major test when a series of car break-ins hit Oak Ridge's business district. Instead of reverting to traditional police responses, the department doubled down on their new approach. Officers worked with business owners to improve security while maintaining the friendly, open atmosphere they'd built. Officer Reynolds organized late-night community walks, bringing together officers, business owners, and residents to patrol the areas together. During one such walk, a shop owner who had initially been skeptical of the department's changes spotted suspicious activity. Instead of calling 911, she directly contacted Reynolds on his department-issued community line. The resulting arrest demonstrated the power of their integrated approach. The suspect was caught not through aggressive policing, but through community partnership. More importantly, the incident strengthened rather than damaged police-community relations. However, not all challenges were external. Some veteran officers struggled with the new expectations, particularly the requirement for regular community engagement. During a tense morning briefing, one senior officer voiced his concerns. "We're police officers, not social workers," he argued. "All this hand-holding is making us soft." The chief listened patiently, then pulled up the department's recent statistics. Crime rates had dropped significantly in areas where community engagement was highest. Response times had improved because citizens were more willing to provide accurate, timely information. Even officer safety had improved, with fewer hostile encounters during routine calls. "We're not becoming soft," the chief responded. "We're becoming smart." He shared body camera footage from a recent domestic disturbance call, where an officer's community connections had helped de-escalate a potentially violent situation. "This isn't just about feeling good, it's about being more effective at our jobs." Officer Chen had started mentoring newer officers in community engagement techniques. During one session, a rookie asked him how he handled the emotional drain of being constantly engaged with the community's problems. Chen smiled, pulling out his department phone. "See these messages?" He showed the rookie texts from community members sharing their successes, their gratitude, their small victories. "This isn't a drain, it's what fills you up." The department's challenges had begun attracting a different kind of attention. Police academies were reaching out, wanting to incorporate Oak Ridge's experiences into their training programs. The chief saw another opportunity. He worked with officers Reynolds and Chen to develop a curriculum that addressed not just the successes, but the struggles and solutions they'd found along the way. As the sun set over Oak Ridge one evening, the chief found himself back in the neighborhood where he'd been pulled over 3 months ago. The same elderly resident who had recorded the viral video was tending her garden. She waved him over, proud to show him the new community watch signs they'd installed, signs that featured both police and citizen contact numbers. "You know," she said, adjusting her gardening hat, "when I recorded that video, I thought I was documenting another problem. Instead, I caught the beginning of a solution." She pointed to a group of kids playing basketball with Officer Reynolds in a nearby driveway. "But solutions aren't always easy, are they?" The chief watched as Reynolds paused the game to chat with a passing patrol car, sharing information about recent community concerns. "No," he agreed, "they're not easy. But they're worth it." He pulled out his phone, showing her the latest department statistics. "Every challenge we face is teaching us something new about what works and what doesn't." As he walked back to his car, the chief reflected on how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. The true test of their changes wouldn't be in the initial transformation, but in how they handled the everyday challenges that followed. In his pocket, his phone buzzed with new messages, more departments seeking guidance, more community members reaching out, more challenges to face. But now, they were facing them together. 6 months had passed since that fateful traffic stop, and Oak Ridge had become nearly unrecognizable, in the best possible way. The police station's once sterile halls now displayed vibrant community artwork, while the parking lot hosted weekly farmers' markets where officers and residents mingled freely. But today was special. The department was celebrating its first graduation ceremony for the Community Police Academy. The community center auditorium was packed with faces both familiar and new. In the front row, officers Reynolds and Chen sat with their families, their badges gleaming under the lights. The chief stood at the podium, surveying the crowd with quiet pride. Among the graduates were local business owners, former critics of the department, and even the elderly woman who had recorded the viral video that started it all. 6 months ago, the chief began, his voice carrying across the hushed room, a traffic stop went wrong in our community. But sometimes, what seems like an ending becomes a beginning. He gestured to the graduating class, 20 citizens who had completed intensive training in police procedures, community relations, and collaborative problem-solving. One of the graduates was a young man who had once been arrested by Officer Reynolds. Now, he was preparing to enter the police academy himself, inspired by the changes he'd witnessed. During his speech, he turned to Reynolds. "You showed me that change is possible, not just in a department, but in a person." The ceremony took an unexpected turn when a representative from the State Police Academy stepped forward. They had officially adopted the Oak Ridge model into their standard training curriculum. Officer Chen, who had helped develop the training materials, watched from his seat as video clips played showing his community engagement techniques being taught to new recruits across the state. After the ceremony, the chief found himself back in the Oak Ridge neighborhood where his Jeep had been searched. The street looked different now. Community Watch signs stood alongside newly planted trees, each one representing a partnership between police and residents. Children played freely, waving to passing patrol cars instead of running from them. Reynolds and Chen had organized a celebration cookout in the same spot where they had once torn through the chief's belongings. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, but it served as a powerful symbol of transformation. Residents and officers shared meals and stories, while kids played basketball on a court that had been built through their collaborative efforts. An older officer who had initially resisted the changes approached the chief, holding a plate of food. "I didn't believe it would work," he admitted. "Thought it was all just PR. But yesterday, we solved a major case because a grandmother felt comfortable enough to come to us with information. She said she'd never have done that 6 months ago." The department's statistics told a compelling story. Crime rates had dropped by 45%, officer complaints were down by 70%, and community tips had increased by 200%. But the real success stories were in the small moments: the thank you cards covering the station's bulletin board, the officers being invited to family celebrations, the teenagers who now wanted to become police officers, like Officer Chen. As evening approached, the chief gathered everyone for a special presentation. The damaged family photo that had become their symbol of change was officially retired. In its place, they unveiled a new mural painted by local artists, showing the journey from that first traffic stop to today. The images flowed from darkness to light, from confrontation to collaboration. Officer Reynolds stood before the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. 6 months ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career. But our chief showed us that mistakes don't have to define us, they can refine us. He turned to the group of teenagers he'd been mentoring. Remember that when life gets tough, every ending can be a new beginning. The celebration was interrupted by a call, a situation developing at a local convenience store. The response demonstrated how much had changed. Instead of rushing in with sirens blaring, the responding officers coordinated with community leaders who were already on scene. The situation was resolved through dialogue instead of confrontation, with both officers and citizens working together. Later that night, as the chief prepared to leave the station, he found Officers Reynolds and Chen in the briefing room, already planning their next community initiative. "You know," Chen said, looking up from their notes, "that traffic stop was probably the best thing that could have happened to this department." The chief smiled, remembering his own anger and disappointment from that night. "It's not about what happens to us," he replied, "it's about what we do with it." He picked up their proposal, a plan to expand their youth mentorship program to neighboring cities. As they walked to their cars, they passed the wall of community photos. Each image told a story of transformation: former critics becoming allies, troubled youth becoming mentors, officers becoming community leaders. The changes hadn't been easy, but they had been worth every challenge. Outside, the night shift officers were starting their patrol, each one stopping to chat with residents who were still out enjoying the evening. The scene was strikingly different from 6 months ago. There was no tension, no fear, just people working together to keep their community safe. The chief's phone buzzed with a message from another department requesting guidance on implementing their own changes. As he looked up at the station, now a beacon of hope for other communities, he realized that their story wasn't ending, it was still being written, one relationship at a time. That viral video still circulated occasionally, but now it was shown alongside new footage, officers playing basketball with kids, helping elderly residents with groceries, working alongside community members to solve problems. It had become a before and after snapshot, proving that even the darkest moments could lead to the brightest changes. As the chief drove home that night, he passed the spot where he'd been pulled over 6 months ago. The street sign now bore a small plaque, "Where Change Began." It wasn't just about one department's transformation anymore, it was about showing the world that change was possible, one community at a time.